The Abu Dhabi Institute organizes a regular series of these public lectures, almost weekly, in fact. And I would like to draw your attention especially to Thursday evening. There will be a music performance by musicians and musical styles from all over the world. So I hope you can all attend that event. Both public events are actually part of a 4-day workshop that started today, also organized and sponsored by the Abu Dhabi Institute. The title of this workshop is Musical Rhythm, Cross-Disciplinary and Multicultural Perspectives. And this workshop has brought together some 40 experts from around the world who are presenting their research and trying to unravel the mysteries of musical rhythm. This evening, we are fortunate to have a panel discussion with 4 distinguished world experts on musical rhythm, and they will be introduced by the panel moderator, Carlos Guedes, who just joined the NYU Abu Dhabi faculty as a professor of music, coming from Porto in Portugal.
Thank you very much, Gottfried. Good evening, everyone. I would like to give you a warm welcome to this panel, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Stephen McAdams from the University of McGill, Edward Large from the Center of Complex Systems and Brain Science in Florida, Xavier Serra from University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and Kofi Agao from Princeton University. Each one of these experts represents one field of knowledge. Steve McAdams represents cognition, Edward Large, neuroscience, Xavier Serra, music information retrieval, and Kofi Agao, music theory and ethnomusicology. So the challenge was to ask these experts to explain to us what is rhythm in their field of knowledge. So each one of them is going to do a short presentation of 10 minutes about that. Then I'm going to ask them probably 1 or 2 questions, and I'm going to turn the discussion into the public so that you can ask whatever questions you have about this. Okay, thank you very much. So it is my pleasure to introduce Steve McAdams.
It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about musical rhythm and aspects from music cognition. One of the first things to understand is a number of definitions about different things that are involved in our perception of rhythm. Of course, one important one is the notion of duration, which is a kind of psychological correlate of time. So that could be the time that an event lasts or the time between 2 events. Another one that's very important, particularly for rhythm perception, is the inter-onset interval. That is, we are very particularly interested in when we're clapping a rhythm or something like that. It's the time between the onsets of the intervals. And in music cognition, we talk a lot about the inter-onset interval, and I'll use this term a lot, so I wanted to bring that up. Rhythm itself, as we've been talking in our workshop, is very complicated, and nobody really seems to know what it is. And as Large said, if you don't know what rhythm is, then if you don't know how to define rhythm, then you can't really have it. So the pattern of relations among these intervals of time, also the durations of those events, and also the accents that are happening on them are very important. So if I'm clapping a rhythm, it's like that thing that's very important. But then you can take other rhythms by changing the accents, and by changing the different durations, you will change the rhythm pattern that people are perceiving. A lot of rhythms also have something behind them, which is a kind of regular beat pattern that you're picking up on. And this is the kind of thing that you will dance to, or snap your fingers to, or clap to as you're listening to. And this is oftentimes based on picking up very regular intervals in these inter-onset intervals. Of course, all of these can happen at different rates, so we have the notion of tempo as well. Is it a fast piece or a slow piece? And that's all based on rhythmic perception as well. And of course, one of the most exciting things about rhythm in a lot of different cultures is the fact that there are certain things, if you play a piece of music, you can tap to it at various levels of the rhythm. So I'm going to play you a little example here, and some beats are considered to be stronger than others, okay? So if I'm playing along something that's in 4, I'll be having 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or if it's in 3s, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the meter is the fact that every certain number of those beats is actually stronger than the other ones. And this can happen at a bunch of different levels. What I'd like to do is to play you a little example from some Brazilian music, and you can try to figure out how often do you hear the strong beats in this kind of a piece of music. First of all, there's the beat. So this would be in a 3 meter. Now, as you can hear, there's all kinds of variations of things going on in there, things like syncopation and so on and so forth, but I won't go into all of these aspects for the moment. Now, one of the things about the rhythm that's important to understand is that there are limits to the kinds of durations and intervals of time between events that we can actually perceive as rhythm. So, for example, if I have sounds that are separated by more than about 1.5 seconds, I hear isolated sounds. I don't actually hear a rhythmic pattern, okay? So, for example, if I play you a rhythm that goes like, it's kind of hard to integrate all that into a rhythm. If I played a lot faster, I'm hearing that. So you see, when you stretch things out too far, you don't have the possibility of actually integrating it into a pattern that you can perceive. In the other direction, if you go too fast, if events are happening at more than about 10 events per second, then you get something that's more like a continuum. And I'd like to play a little example of a piece by George Ligeti, who's a Hungarian composer. And it's called continuum because he's trying to get a harpsichordist to play so fast that you can't hear the individual events, and you basically hear a kind of a continuous texture. And these are about 14 or 15 events per second here. So there you wouldn't actually say you're hearing rhythm, you're more hearing a continuous texture with some kind of grain to it in that particular sense. So real rhythm perception tends to happen in between those two limits, okay? And there's several different zones, and we have, in psychology, we talk about a sort of an optimal intermediate zone where most of the rhythmic information is happening, and also where we're the best at judging very fine differences in the timings. And that tends to happen at a rate of about 75 to 200 beats per minute in this particular case. Also, one thing that's important to understand about rhythms is what are rhythms calculated on. So we talk about all these different durations that are existing and so on and so forth. But it's important to understand that if I have a bunch of different instruments and they're playing all over the place, I'm not necessarily going to integrate all of those into a perception of a rhythm, okay? And what happens is that sometimes if I have different instruments playing, they have different sound qualities, and my mind is going to tend to focus on each instrument individually. And then the rhythms are calculated on each instrument. They're not calculated across the different instruments, for example. So rhythm is computed on what we call these sort of mental connections of these events, or auditory streams. So I would like to play you a little example of this. I'm going to take a pattern that's a 5-note repeating pattern, which will be played by a clarinet. And you'll be able to hear the cycling of the 5 notes. So you hear a kind of rhythm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then suddenly that pattern is going to be played alternating between 3 different instruments. Sort of instrument 1, instrument 2, instrument 3, instrument 1, instrument 2, instrument 3. And that 5-note pattern, it's going to become difficult to hear that anymore. And then we're going to get worse. We're going to spread it across instruments that are even more different. So we have strings and brass and woodwinds and so on and so forth. And then the 5-note pattern, you won't be able to perceive it at all anymore. You'll have a completely different one because you'll be perceiving the rhythm on each individual instrument. Find the cursor here. There it is. This is actually based on a piece written by an American composer named Robert Erickson in California. Finally, there's this notion of metric hierarchy, okay, that I was talking about before, and this was the notion that there's a whole bunch of different ways of taking care of beats. So if I have this rhythm, which you see up here, which basically is taken out of a piece by Mozart. Whoops, what happened? Go back. Okay, which is basically just going. okay? And I can do this at a bunch of different levels. So I can go something like this. Da 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 da. And that's one level, which is at the eighth note level that I'm playing there. But I can also go da 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 da, and there's at the quarter note level. Or I can go da 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 da, and so on and so forth. So you can see there's a bunch of different levels. And this is one of the properties of what we call meter, so that you have this hierarchy of things that are at longer and longer durations that are, the other ones are nested inside of that particular one. Now, one interesting thing about meter is how you take this pattern and actually extract this regular meter depends very much on the culture that you're in, okay? Because you learn these patterns. And I'm going to play one last example here, which is taken from the Congo. And it's a piece that's being played in the area called Mokongo, and it's a bunch of the villagers here are all playing together on this log drum. And what I'll do is you hear this rhythm, and I want you to start imagining in your mind, if you were to clap your hands along with it, where would that happen? And then I'm going to fade the music down and have somebody from this culture start doing the clapping so you can see how they hear it, and you can compare if it's the same with what you're actually trying to do. That's it. And so there are a few aspects of the cognition of musical rhythm. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. So I thought it would be fun when it got to be my turn to actually address the exact title of, or see if I could address the title of the panel, which is Rhythm. What is it? Who has it? And why? Okay, so the first question is, what is it? Now, Steve really gave us a brilliant overview of a lot of things that are known about rhythm. Here, what I've done is I've notated a metrical hierarchy, and what I'm going to do then is I'm going to notate some rhythms up here. So in these metrical hierarchies, what we have usually, as Steve told us about, are strong beats and not so strong beats and weaker beats and very weak beats. So the strongest beats are the beats where these dots at the various levels align. Here's a simple 3/4, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4. But rhythms, if we actually were to play a rhythm that exactly corresponded to that pattern, it would be kind of boring. But let's do it anyway. What the heck? So here's a pattern, and I've constructed this pattern so that beats or sounds tend to occur on strong beats. So the strongest beat has a sound here and a sound here. The second strongest beats, we're going to give a sound here and a sound here. Okay, and there we go. I've started playing it already. Okay, so that's this sound. Now, one of the kinds of things we think about in neuroscience is how do you go from that kind of a pattern to this sort of metrical framework? What is the brain doing to understand where the beat is, where you're going to tap your foot? Well, when I talk about this problem to physicists say, well, I mean, that must be pretty simple. What you can do is you can represent the sound of that rhythm and then do a frequency analysis. And this is something physicists do all the time. So if I were to plot a frequency analysis of this rhythm, and here, this is the frequency that corresponds to the quarter note level, and this is the frequency that corresponds to the eighth note level, and so forth, what you'll see is the quarter note level, where you might want to tap your foot when you listen to that rhythm, has a lot of energy at that frequency. Okay? But as I already noted, that's a kind of a boring rhythm. What happens, let's make this rhythm a little bit more interesting. What happens if I say move that note that occurs on a strong beat over to a weaker beat, and maybe move that note that occurs on a strong beat over to a weaker beat? Then we're going to get a rhythm called a son clave. It's the kind of thing we like to listen to in Florida. It's an Afro-Cuban rhythm. Okay? And so that's what the rhythm would be notated like, and here's what it sounds like. Has the same pulse, at least nominally. If we were to bring someone in the lab and ask them to tap the pulse, they would tap the same pulse. But if we look at a frequency analysis of that rhythm, all of a sudden we see that the amount of energy at the pulse, where people would tap, is much lower than in the simpler rhythm. And in fact, there are other frequencies flanking that pulse rhythm that have stronger energy. So we could ask, well, why don't you hear the pulse at that frequency or this frequency? Now, I could make this rhythm even a little more complicated. I could go from son clave to rumba clave, and that just entails moving this note over to the neighboring weak beat. Okay, here's what that one would sound like. So again, the same pulse, but now we get even greater syncopation. And if we look at the frequency analysis, as the physicists tell us to do, almost all the energy at that pulse frequency has gone away. Okay, so in terms of this question, what is it? Well, a rhythm you might think of, as Steve told us, as a pattern of inter-onset intervals, but there's somehow an associated pattern, an associated structure that structures our perception. And the interesting thing is that structure can have very little to do with the frequencies that are actually present in the rhythm. Okay, well, that's an interesting thing. So we're going to think about how that happens. That will be under the why section. Let's ask the question, who has it? Who has the ability to do this, to understand where the beat is in a rhythm and maybe to synchronize with the rhythm? Well, human adults have it. We can bring them into the lab. We can ask them to listen to a rhythm. We can measure their brain waves. And we can see that their brain waves entrain, and I'll show you this in a minute, will entrain or synchronize to that pulse frequency. What about children? Well, children have been tested in a number of different ways. One thing you could do is you could ask if children can tap that pulse. And it turns out that for infants, okay, infants, they move more when they listen to music, but they are not synchronized to a pulse. And if you test 2.5 to 4.5-year-olds, they show some tendency towards synchronization, but they don't really do it either. So it takes children about 5 years to really develop this ability to hear and synchronize to the pulse in complex rhythms. But we could ask, what's happening in the brain? Maybe this is just an inability to synchronize. Maybe the brain knows what's going on. You can actually test infants, and you can measure their brain waves. And some recent evidence suggests that infants, in fact, are able to hear the pulse in very complex rhythms, even though they don't move their body naturally to those rhythms. So humans can do it. It takes a little while to develop, but humans can do it. What about animals? Well, in 2007, I was working on a review of musical rhythm, and I found myself writing in the introduction of the review that musical rhythm is interesting because only humans can do it. You know, there are some animals that synchronize, crickets and frogs tend to synchronize and so forth, but really only humans can synchronize to musical rhythm. And the following year, this video appeared on YouTube, and this is Snowball. How many of you have seen Snowball on YouTube? This is very interesting. I tried to set up the web so we could watch this video here, and I wasn't able to quite get on the web tonight, but go home and Google Snowball and watch Snowball dance to the Backstreet Boys. It's really very convincing. So it turns out cockatoos seem to be able to do this. Okay, how well synchronized Snowball actually is a matter of some controversy, but you'll find that a very convincing dance. Okay? Now, why this animal and no others? Well, there's a theory that says that Snowball can do this because Snowball is a kind of a species that learns its own communication signals. It's a member of a vocal learning species. Other vocal learning species are seals, for example, elephants, what else is a vocal learning species? Dolphins, cetaceans, okay? So maybe that's what it is, but it turns out that also primates can do this. So a group in Mexico trained macaque monkeys to synchronize with the beat, and we are now actually working with bonobos in the Jacksonville Zoo and asking whether they're able to synchronize to a beat. It turns out it looks like from our first analysis they're able to match tempo, and we're now asking whether they can synchronize. Okay, the question now, why? Well, one of our distinguished members of our workshop over the next 4 days, Georgi Bazaki, would, I think, suggest that the more interesting question is, why not? Why wouldn't you be able to? The brain rhythms seem to be all over the brain, and the brain does what it does through synchronizing rhythms and through all kinds of rhythmic interactions between different frequencies. We can see this in data. We could see this also in computer simulations, actually. You may have heard about the Blue Brain project. In fact, the European Union has just decided to make a major investment in this project in which attempts to simulate one cortical column in the brain in great detail. Here's a really interesting another model that comes from the Neuroscience Institute. It attempts to make a biologically accurate computer model of the entire brain. And it's based on actual connection data. This is diffusion tensor imaging data. And if we look at, if we look at what this model does, you can see, try that again. If we look at what this model does, you can see waves, spatial waves and synchronization among all different parts of the brain. So it turns out that what's happening when we listen to music is that neural signals are synchronizing. Here are the arrows. These are the places where there are sounds in the rhythm, and these are 3 different tempos, and this is a random rhythm. And it turns out that brain waves are actually able to synchronize to the sounds that we listen to. Okay? So rhythm and oscillation is a fundamental property of the brain. So it would be kind of surprising if that weren't involved in some way in our experience of musical rhythm, and it turns out that it is. Okay, we'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, hello everyone. So my area of research is basically from engineering. So in engineering, we look at rhythm, but we look at it more from a more practical point of view, maybe to do things with it. So thanks to all the research that people are doing in different fields, we now know enough to be able to do things with it. So in music information retrieval, basically was a field that was greatly developed in the last few years because of the need to handle the web, with the need to handle lots of data, lots of musical data, and to be able to make some sense out of that, to order all that, to build systems that take advantage of that. So the research in this field that we call MIR is basically data processing. It's basically about manipulating data and trying to, through that, understand the phenomena that this data expresses, and in our case, rhythm. So we want to develop technologies that process this data and that take advantage of all these methodologies. And finally, as normally what all engineering fields are involved with, we want to build things that are useful for some people, for society, for researchers, or for any type of application. So we like to develop services, applications that can create, interact with this musical information. Let me put an example of an application that already exists, that we developed, and that they're starting to come up things like that. Maybe some of you even have one. There are several brands that do. Nike has a system like that, and we developed that together with a spin-off company and with Yamaha that we have. This is a system that for runners, for jogging, while you jog, the music that you listen actually is selected according to your heartbeat. so that when you are in a slow pace and you hear more of a relaxing type of music, and when you are running more and you want to speed up, then the music speeds up. So there is a system that we developed that basically detects the beat that you just heard. It's not exactly the beat, because the concept of the perception of the beat of what you would like the music to be like for a given pace, it doesn't correlate exactly to the standard beat, but basically we try to develop an automatic system that would analyze the music and would choose the music within your MP3 player that follow that. Okay, so this is an example so that you get an idea the kinds of things that are being done in music information retrieval and applications. There are many others, but this is one that you can keep in mind. So what are the challenges from that? Clearly, when you look at science, it's very, I think it's easier because it's basically want to understand things. We want to understand what is rhythm. We want to understand how we perceive it. In an engineering field, what do we want to do? What are the challenges that researchers are involved with? And so these are some of them in the music field. Basically, in order to do research, if in engineering, if in science, you need subjects and you need to be able to work with them. In music information retrieval, we need data. We need data that is useful. We need data of music data, rhythm data that we can analyze. And we need representations. We need a way that the computer can process these data. So we need a way to express these data to the computer. And we need methodologies to process these data. And a lot of the things that are happening now is to process large quantities of data. So Google constantly processes large quantities of data. And iTunes, when it recommends you a piece of music, it has to process large quantities of data. So this is the kinds of things we have to do it. And we can do it from a bottom-up, from a data point of view, or from a knowledge point of view. And this is the kinds of things that relate more to the scientific aspect. We know what rhythm, so let's try to use that knowledge to process the data with that point of view. And of course, finally, we want to estimate things that make sense musically. We want to estimate the beat. We want to estimate the measure. So in fact, for us, for an engineer, what rhythm is kind of the topics that are best known from a scientific point of view, that we know what they are, that we can ask users to mark the data with, so that we can use annotated data from a user marking the beats or marking the pulse or identifying the tempo. And then from an audio signal, we can actually automatically, and that's the sort of the aim, automatically mark these known rhythm concepts. So typically a system, so we develop systems that process data. And so a system that would automatically describe rhythm, for example, that application that I just showed, would have an audio input. It would extract some features, some aspects of the audio, and would start identifying these elements, the tempo, the beat, the swing aspect, how it deviates, and the time signatures. And it would come up with a representation of the rhythm that then, in real time, this jogging system would allow you to synchronize your heartbeat with the representation of that piece of music. And if we go into different aspects, so for example, the beat, that maybe is the one that has been worked the most, because maybe is the most intuitive, and for Western pop music, maybe the most clear concept of rhythm. And it's quite a useful element for DJs and, for example, that application to try to automatically identify the beat of a piece of music. And, well, I'm not going to go into detail, but basically we want to convert the audio signal into something. Maybe it's not cognitively, perceptually coherent, or it may be, if we would ask a neuroscientist how relevant or how meaningful is this intermediate representation, maybe it's not the most scientifically correct one, but it works. And that's the kind of things that we normally excuse ourselves with. Maybe the representation of periodicity is not a meaningful representation from a brain point of view, but it works. For example, in order to identify the meter, so we work on this kind of matrix similarity type of representations that allows us to see symmetries and allows us to see and extract some of these repetitions and structures that music has. Or, for example, a typical one, a very important concept in rhythm is the rhythmic pattern. So most musics are characterized by some rhythmic pattern. So, for example, in dance music, a very important thing is to be able to separate or distinguish these types of rhythmics. But okay, this is basically all based on the audio. And to finish, basically, I want to play you a sound example. And in fact, it will be a way to introduce you to the concert of Thursday. On Thursday, one of the pieces you're going to be hearing is a piece played on the madranga on Carnatic music. Akshay, who is a researcher, and in fact, I collaborate with him in a project in which we are trying to understand things that go beyond this Western type of perspective. And Carnatic music is a perfect example to see how easy our engineering approaches break miserably. So I want to finish with sort of throwing stones on my roof. In this type of music, let me just briefly, you'll hear an audio, and I don't know how many of you have been into a Carnatic music concert, but typically the musician in front of him would have someone marking the rhythm for him so that the musician himself can play better. So in fact, the drummer is not keeping the tempo, or he's not keeping, so that if he's accompanying a singer, he's not really accompanying it. The singer also needs a visual cue to help the rhythm. So it's a perfect example of something that for us is awful, which the sound we hear may not include the rhythm. In fact, the rhythm may be implicit. It's not explicit in the audio. So let's just maybe think if we go. Oh, sorry. I thought this was an application that would. So this is a typical improvisation of a madranga in which starts kind of simple, but even the simplicity is not marking the downbeats. In fact, if you hear, there is someone that is marking with a hand. We don't hear it. Who's marking the actual beat. And progressively, it gets quite complicated. Now I cannot fast forward, but let me just, let's hear it a little bit. And in fact, this is one of the rhythms that are studied quite as an example of very complex rhythm by contemporary musicians, jazz musicians, and contemporary music musicians. If they can handle these, I mean, they really are doing very well on rhythm understanding. And one of the advantages of this type of music is that it's a classical tradition. It's a tradition that is studied, has been studied for a long time in a very formal way. If you talk with the performers, they are very conscious of the mathematical complexities they are dealing with. And they have to spend hours and hours trying to really understand the multiple complex issues that are taking place. So if we would just finish it, but well, we will stop now. Let's hear it a little bit more. But anyway, I recommend you to come on Thursday, and you will hear live Akshay playing for us some of these rhythms on this instrument, the madranga. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I've been asked to talk about rhythm from the perspective of my field. The fields assigned to me are two: music theory and ethnomusicology. My own research interests center, however, on certain sub-Saharan African musics, specifically West and Central Africa. So rather than try to present an overview of rhythm studies in 2 large fields plus a subfield in 10 minutes, I thought I'd highlight just one particular feature of African rhythm, namely polyrhythm. That is several different rhythms performed simultaneously. And I'd like to use that highlighting to initiate a broader discussion of some of the properties and values associated with African rhythm. I was going to tell you a little bit about the literature on African rhythm, but it's too large for me to do it justice. I just believe that there is a great deal of research on African music from at least the 1920s on. So now, what I'd like to do is just play you a couple of examples to start with. So this is music from Uganda. It's polyrhythmic. Okay, that's one example. Play you another example. This one from Ghana. Bell. Second bell. Ta 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 ta. Hand clap. Ta 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 ta. That's the call. A drum. Another drum. Goes with several rhythms, yeah? That's the call of the elephant horns. Response. Ti, 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 ti. That's where the beat is. Okay. Okay. So now I thought, since you're all expert rhythmicists, we should do one polyrhythm. This will make me very happy. So I'm just going to teach you very quickly a Gahu rhythm. It's an Ewe rhythm. And folks here, you're the bell. So we'll just speak the rhythms. Don't worry. You're not going to drum anything. So it's kong, 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 kong. As soon as you're comfortable, join in, because we don't have a lot of time, right? Kong, 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 kong. But it has to have some energy. Kong, 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 kong. So folks at the back there, pati, 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 papa. Pati, 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 papa. Pati, pati. I can't hear you. Pati, 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 papa. Pati, 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 papa. Pati, 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 papa. Folks here, you're up the beat. Kata, 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 ka. Kong, 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 kong. Kong, 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 wait. Kata, 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 ka. Then ton ton, then ton ton, then ton ton, then ton ton. This has to be loud. Then ton ton. Folks at the back. Ton ton, again, again. Ton ton, again, again. Ton ton, again, again. Ton, and the rest of you. Giddy, 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 giddy. You guys join in. Kong, 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 kong. Pati, 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 papa. Pati, 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 pa. Kata, 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 kata. Then ton ton, then ton ton, then ton ton, then ton ton. Ton ton, again, again. Ton ton, again, again. Ton ton. Giddy, 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 giddy. Now as loud as you can make it. Okay, okay, okay. That's not bad. Okay. What are you doing? Applauding yourselves? That was 3 out of 10. Here's what it should sound like. Don't go. That was you. Pati 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 papa. Pati 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 pa. Kida kada 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 kada. Den ton ton, den ton ton, den ton ton. Okay. Okay. All right, very good. You guys, you did okay. So then what is polyrhythm in West Central African music? Poly, of course, means many. And, well, rhythm, we keep saying we don't know. It's a pattern of differently weighted onsets and durations. It's very close to your definition, I think, Stephen. So the components of a polyrhythmic texture number at least 2, right? Polyrhythm more typically is associated with ensemble performance than solo performance. It's equally characteristic of vocal and instrumental music. This is important. Then, in general, none of the constituent rhythms merely marks a beat or a pulse. Each component also carves time by opposing at least 2 contrasting durations. The rhythms of a polyphonic texture unfold simultaneously. Each constituent rhythm is subject to extensive repetition, as you just did, and the repetition is often without variation. Right? Only the lead drummer, or what we call the mother drummer, varies his patterns, creating them in the moment sometimes. Occasionally, there's a support drum that has some changing patterns as well. So the resultant sound of a polyphonic ensemble is not haphazard or merely fortuitous or accidental, the way you did it. On the contrary, it's an orderly simultaneity based on a series of intended interactions among instruments and a supplementary dance, which I didn't ask you to do. Indeed, for obvious reasons. Indeed, in some African traditions, one cannot perform or understand the individual rhythms if one does not also know the resultant in a simplified form. So I'll just finish with a few broad statements about polyrhythm. First, about the ethos of polyrhythm. Polyrhythm is achieved through a disciplined and disciplining effort. The resulting complexity is a rational complexity, not an outcome based on happenstance or a vaguely sensed simultaneous doing. The ethos is communal and indexes cooperation rather than competition. Polyrhythm manifests a many-in-one philosophy. So that's the first thing. Then about the features of polyrhythm. There is a governing meter, as you saw, that one was in 4, based on a specified number of beats per cycle. The beat is not necessarily articulated directly by any one of the instruments. Even though patterns may start at different points within a cycle, they are constrained by a single regulative beat. So the individual instruments here do not have their own beat references. A third thing, this has to do with pedagogy. No one counts rhythms. So I wouldn't be teaching you this by saying 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, or anything like that. No one counts rhythms. And finally, why polyrhythm in Africa? I think because Africans enjoy playing with rhythms. However, some more imaginative scholars have linked polyrhythm to other polys. So John Collins, for example, says that in Africa there's something called a polysided life. And I'm quoting Collins now, that African music is polyphonal, their religions are polytheistic, their calendars are polycyclic, their plastic arts are polyangled, and their social organization polycentric. Marriage is customarily polygamous, and so on. All of this is true, but Collins doesn't actually specify exactly how these practices and domains entail each other. He only notes that their coexistence. So I'll leave you to mull that one over. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I think we have 4 very interesting interventions from you gentlemen. Thank you so much. I would like to start posing you a question because this is the relationship of rhythm and beat. Because we all talk about rhythms and people talk about beats also and pulse on that, but do you think it is possible to have rhythms without beats? I would start by you, Steve.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of examples of non-beat rhythms. For example, in the alap phase of a raga, for example, there are various kinds of phases that are unmeasured in Arabic taksim, for example. In Western music, we have unmeasured preludes for harpsichord and so on and so forth, where it's the relative long and short durations and a kind of a expanding, contracting durations that are the point and not necessarily something that underlies it. I'd still say that that was rhythm.
Okay. Edward?
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, there are many forms of music in which rhythms occur without a beat. I would point out, though, that rhythm, the rhythms that do have a beat, that tends to be one of the great universals in rhythm. I mean, it's found in almost every culture. Although in every culture there are some forms of music that don't have a beat. To bring it back to neuroscience for a minute, I think this is one of the sort of the things that I think people have problems conceiving how rhythms in the brain might relate to rhythms in music, because if you look at rhythms in the brain, they're also very irregular. So one of the things that rhythm in music might do is impose some sort of regularity on those neural rhythms, but not necessarily a simple pulse.
Okay, thank you. Well, Xavier.
Well, I guess from an engineering point of view, I could say that beat detection is one of the most common tasks to be done. And there is a lot of music that this beat detection fails miserably. So I would like to believe that there are many music that has no beat, because otherwise means that our work would be very bad, because we are not able to detect, our algorithms are not able to detect the beat in a lot of the music that is around the world.
What strategies would you use then to try to detect rhythms that don't have a beat?
Well, so for me, it's an ill-posed problem. I mean, it should not be done. I mean, there are many pieces of music that the beat tapping along does not make sense. So we should, we tend to, and I guess engineers to think that we should tap to things and find the beats, but many music, we never tap to the music. Many cultures do not tap to many types of music. So yeah, beat detection does not make sense in many situations.
Okay, thank you. Coffee?
I'm trying to understand why you asked that question. Because, of course, a lot depends on what you mean by beat. And I take it that a beat is something apart from a pulse, apart from an underlying pulse. It's on maybe a higher hierarchic level, perhaps? Is that right?
No, I was referring to actually the underlying pulse, basically what you tap, because you're all playing examples of music that clearly had an underlying pulse, so you could actually tap to sort of a temporal regularity.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would just echo what Stephen said about a large number of repertories that, well, Kurt Sachs would say come actually from the speech or song side of things. So something along the lines of recitative or something declamatory that lacks any kind of clear beat, although it has rhythm because it has a set of durations, it has some accentual differentiation and so on. So there is that, and that's a very large body of things. And in fact, in some repertories, there's an interaction between that, which you could call free rhythm of some sort, and something stricter. In fact, there are situations in which you think you're hearing a strict rhythm, but there are moments when you go into a free-ish rhythm, where you're not chained to the beat structure. You're allowed a little flexibility, but you come back. So the two domains, I would say, are actually quite interpenetrated in some repertories, in some African repertories that I know. So yes, there is music without a beat. That was your question.
No,
but
not music, not music, rhythm.
I'm
rhythm.
sorry. Yes, I'm getting confused now. You go on.
But there's also rubato music as well, right? So it's music that has a beat,
Yeah.
but the beat changes frequency constantly. And it's a very powerful kind of music if you listen to romantic piano music or a ballad or something like
Gamelan, you have lots of
Yes.
slowing down and
that.
speeding up.
And if you ask people to come in and tell you where the beat is, they'll tap a beat and they'll speed up and they'll slow down.
Yeah. But I was actually referring to other types of rhythms that can be more complex, and you're not able to extract that because.
Well, this
you know,
is somewhere maybe in
In
between
the case of
that.
the rubato, yes, you're able to accompany that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. The other question I would have to you, it's regard to universality of concepts. You know, people think that music is this universal language, and in fact, music is common to, it's a common feature of every culture. And yet, you know, this afternoon we're discussing this what is rhythm session, and Kofi was saying that there's no such idea or the definition of rhythm in African music as we have or commonly taught about what rhythm is, and I would like to probably have some comments on that in terms of I mean. Of this idea of rhythm and some sort of, or at least as we understand it, to exist, you know, across cultures or not, and how would that be seen in the absence of that concept?
Yeah, can I just clarify
Sure.
the context of that discussion? I think I was in a session with colleagues and we're talking about what rhythm is, and I was pointing out that in many sub-Saharan African languages, there is no word for rhythm. So you couldn't go to somebody and say, dude, I'd like to discuss rhythm with you. It's not a conversation you can have if you use those words. However, ideas of rhythm obviously circulate in many languages. They're probably positioned differently. In other words, the semantic fields are distributed differently so that accents or duration, things like that can be talked about, except you just don't have this neat mapping of, you know, the word rhythm into Luo or Ewe or Yoruba. So that was the context of, so it's not a denial of the existence of something called rhythm, it's a denial of a specific Greek-originated category that you use in English to talk about rhythm. That's the clarification I wanted to make.
Thank you very much, very interesting. I'd be interested maybe to venture a little bit about not polyphonic type of music, but monophonic type of music, which Arabic music is known for. In your discussions, and presumably in the next few days you'll be discussing this, I'd be interested to learn some more about, you know, rhythm and this type of music, monophonic music, which doesn't have maybe certainly the polyphonic type of rhythm that you mentioned in African cultures. Thank you.
Maybe I can talk a little bit about that. I am leading a project, an European project that involves the study of different world music traditions, and specifically two Islamic music traditions, the Turkish Makam music and the Arab Andalusi music. It doesn't cover the Oriental Arab. So all these are normally what they would be called heterophonic music, and in which there is a kind of a monophonic kind of lead voice, and there is always a drum underneath all the time following. In Turkish there is the concept of uzul, and in Andalusi music is another concept. So there is very little work from a research point of view in this type of traditions. The one that has been worked the most is the Turkish one. In fact, here there is a number of presentations on Turkish music, and it has been maybe worked the most. And the rhythmic aspect and the concept of uzul and how the complexity of that rhythmic structure differently from the Western, I think is a very, very interesting one. And I'm sure the traditions, the Arab traditions here have things similar to that, and they have not been worked a lot, and they have, for example, something that is very important is asymmetric type of rhythms that are not equally spaced pulses or equally spaced beats that have not been really worked on that much, and it's a very, very interesting problem.
Two questions. One is, how is human intelligence related to the rhythm in a broad way, not in a very deep neurological language? And the second one is, how is the cultural, I mean, different places have different kinds of rhythms and different kinds of music, right? So it could be from the following, it could be from the traditions that are being followed from centuries or from the times behind. How can music be impregnated to a society or to a new culture? Is it possible? Or can African rhythms be everywhere? Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll start.
Go ahead.
That's a tough one, but I'll take a crack at it. So I think one of the interesting things about rhythm is, you know, a certain level of universality about every kind of rhythm. So you can listen to an African rhythm that you've never heard before and maybe get an understanding of the feeling or the emotion, you know, that's elicited in that kind of rhythm. Now, that's not to say that if you're raised in, you know, you will hear it the same way as someone who's raised in that culture. But I think to go to your first question about how it's related to thought or intelligence in general, I would say that the brain is essentially a rhythm generator. So in some very real sense, the thoughts that you have in your head at any given time really consist of a set of interrelated rhythms that are taking place in your brain. So that, you know, sometimes I think that the rhythms of particular cultures train the brains of the people within that culture to think in certain ways and to feel in certain ways. But also, you know, those rhythms have their distinctive kind of affective quality as well, the feelings that are associated with listening to those rhythms.
I'd like to talk a little bit about there's a French-Israeli ethnomusicologist named Simha Aram who's studied the music of Central Africa. And he started doing this when he was 35. He was a French horn player, and then he decided at the age of 35 to go study this music. And he eventually figured out a lot of the principles behind the rhythmic organization of some of the pygmies in Central Africa and so on and so forth. And he said that he realized at one point that when the music started playing, he didn't immediately understand what the rhythmic structure was, what the metric structure was. He could reconstruct it because he knew the rules, but it didn't happen feeling-wise immediately. He felt that that was something that he would never be able to learn because he started too late. So I think there's probably, we can learn certain things and get to feel certain things about these musics, but we won't necessarily be able to instantly get into the rhythmic structures of certain cultures if we learned them too late. And I think some people are now starting to think that there's probably, like in language, a sort of critical age beyond which you can learn the new musical language in an explicit way, but you won't necessarily just absorb it like you do when you're very, very young.
Interesting.
Which doesn't mean you can't like it. But
There's one question there.
It just won't be the same. It won't be the same as thing.
Hey, good evening. Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction to rhythms. Last year, we had a talk just like this one about circadian rhythms. And I had asked a question regarding the perception of more immediate rhythms, like how a drummer keeps the beat, or how, so this is more along the line of neuroscience, and I just wanted to find out if there was any information that is known today about how the brain perceives time, equates pieces of time to be equal to each other, and you know, maintain a beat throughout the entire song.
Well, I mean, I think there are broadly two kinds of theories that are out there. One, which I don't particularly subscribe to, is the idea that the brain runs a clock, and that clock consists of pulses, action potentials in neurons that are essentially random, but they have an average rate. And when you start an event, you know, if you say, I say start timing now, your brain starts that clock, it counts up the pulses. I say stop, and it can, has some idea on that basis. Another kind of theory, the one that I tend to subscribe to, is the idea that neural oscillations are affected, they entrain to events in the world. And it's those events, like speech and like music and like walking, that are rhythmic, that really give us the best indication of how it is that we perceive time.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Going back to rhythm and beat from a very layperson's point of view. I mean, if we see music, music is often associated with dance. So from your presentation, I gather Indian music also has rhythm. But with that rhythm, you have a dance which is very specialized compared to African beat or Latino beat. Everyone can dance. You can just stand up and dance, even if you are not trained. How do you account for these differences? And is there any bearing, like 100 years ago, Max Weber said that Western music is rational, and Eastern music, and he was thinking of China and India, are not rational. So connect these two questions.
I would not agree with the idea of a non-rational of some of these traditions. Of course, like in India and China, there is classical traditions that are music traditions that are very much taught academically, and they are very formalized, and they are studied as Western music are studied, of course, with different approaches. I think the important thing about this beat and dance, there is some musics that are meant to be danced by everyone, and some others that are not, are meant to be enjoyed or appreciated in different ways. So they can be for just to be enjoyed in concerts, or they can be enjoyed in at home, and also for religious purposes, and they don't have to have this dance aspect. So, and that's a lot of music. And of course, there might be dance associated with that as a sort of as an art form, but like in Indian music. But there is a lot of music that is not meant to be danced, and therefore the concept of a very clear beat is not a strong requirement in those types of music.
Thank you very much. My question is a neurobiology question, yet another neurobiology question, which is if any functional MRI studies have been done in terms of where in the brain these types of rhythms are located.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the first place to look is the auditory cortex, and you can see entrainment of rhythms in auditory cortex in many different frequency bands to rhythm. One sort of stunning result that appeared in about 2008, or it stunned some of us anyway, maybe it shouldn't have, was that this similar entrainment takes place in the motor cortices. So the auditory cortex is communicating with the motor cortices, and these may, in fact, it may be these motor areas, and even subcortical areas, it may be these motor areas that are actually responsible for our perception of the beat. And these kinds of things are still being worked out, so I can't sit here and tell you exactly, how, what is the nature of the process that can take a highly syncopated rhythm like I showed you and produce a beat out of that. But it does seem to rely on a communication between auditory and motor areas.
So would this be some kind of simulated action in the brain? That if
Well,
your
that's
brain's
one way of
pretending-
interpreting that, right? I mean, it's very tempting to say that kind of thing, yes. So, but I don't think that's too far afield.
There's a French neuroscientist, Alain Berthoz, who thinks that perception is basically models of action in the brain in some sense.
Right.
Can you please elaborate on the notion that the brain is a rhythm-generating machine, and what do the brain waves that were shown in the presentation correspond to?
Well, that's a big question. If my particular expertise is in the auditory system, and you can see in the auditory system activations that are synchronized, even at very fast rates, hundreds to thousands of cycles per second in the perception of pitch. And as you move up the auditory system, you get slower and slower time scales so that by the time you get to cortex, you've got time scales of rhythms that are in the 1 to 2 hertz range, in the 4 to 8 hertz range, and so forth. You can also look at the relationship between these different rhythms that we see in the brain and the rates of various kinds of stimuli. So that it seems, as Steve said, there's sort of an intermediate preferred range around 2 hertz for rhythm. This is where we would feel the pulse. But for example, for speech, if you look at the repetition rate of syllables in speech, now you're talking about more than twice as fast, about 5 hertz, 5 cycles per second. And it does seem like even when you're talking about tasks that you can't, that are hard to conceive in terms of rhythm. So you talk about musical rhythm, and it seems, well, quite clear that there must be some sort of rhythm in the brain. But if you look at rats navigating in a maze, it's the rhythms in the thalamicortical system that are really instrumental in the way they carry out that activity. There are rhythms in the olfactory system that are important in how we perceive odors. It just seems to be how the brain does its work. Some aspects of it are clearer than others. I mean, and there's a lot to be worked out, obviously. I don't know if Dr. Buzaki would like to comment on that, actually. Is he here? Would you like to comment on that?
Very curious about your opinions. I'm very happy to see this interesting discussion. I have a couple of bad news to tell the audience that unfortunately anywhere you look in the brain, you've got the same kind of rhythms. The auditory system has no special privilege in terms of capturing any of these things. As you pointed out, it's very, very important that you organize information in time. And this is exactly what the brain does. This is what you can call the syntax of the brain. And this is probably the same kind of thing that is the syntax of music. It does it for the same exact thing. What makes the auditory system so special, I think, is the cochlea. The first front where the information comes in. It takes only 100 milliseconds for this Fourier analyzer. This is a special machinery that does what engineers capture about music, that instantaneously it can capture a very large amount of information. This is so different and so differently done in time than the visual system.
Have any studies been done on toddlers, rhythmic studies been done on toddlers that can show their likelihood of possibly becoming child prodigies or show signs of child prodigy?
I don't know if anyone else. I don't know if anyone else knows the direct answer to that question. A number of studies are being done on toddlers, over the past several years, and they're continuing today. We know what normal development is. We know that, toddlers really don't develop this ability to entrain or synchronize until they're about 5 years old. Pardon? Yeah, no, I understand. So what I'm saying
Except
is...
for Michael Jackson.
Except for Michael. So I think if you were to see that very young, then that would, if you were to see it advanced development, that might indicate the kind of thing you're looking for. I know that my daughter, a couple of years ago, strongly suggested that I go see the Justin Bieber movie. And he did seem to be a prodigy, playing extremely sophisticated rhythms at a very young age. Most children can't do that. And that it's a funny thing because a prodigy is not something that has been studied very much in our field, and I think it's something that should be. We tend to look at people who have deficits, who can't do.